To be an effective leader, you need to understand the impact that you have on other people. Read about leadership. I cannot overemphasize enough how important it is to learn about leadership, because I don't think that leadership is intrinsic. Don't assume you know everything. Be willing to take advice and listen to other alternatives, because what gets us in trouble is when we get stuck into one kind of thinking.
Welcome to The Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, we're going to dive into a fundamental aspect of leadership, knowing what you're doing and doing it well. This is one of the 4 C's of leadership, and it is essential, especially in high-stakes environments where lives, careers, or missions are on the line. I'm honored to have my colleague, Dr. Denny Lund, joining us. Dr. Lund is the former Chief Medical Officer of Lucile Packard Children's Hospital, Stanford, where he led clinical operations at one of the most prestigious children's hospitals in the country. With decades of experience as a pediatric surgeon and leader in healthcare, Dr. Lund has had to ensure that competence remains at the forefront of decision-making in high-pressure situations, from the operating room to the boardroom. Denny, thank you for joining me on The Science of Leadership.
Tom, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, jumping into our topic today, as we pull back the cover on it, I think it's safe to say that competence isn't just about having knowledge. It's about applying it effectively, especially when the stakes are high. As you think about it, how do you define competence in high-stakes environments?
Well, that's a tough question. I think that being competent means that you have experience and knowledge in a variety of areas that are pertinent to what you're trying to run, what the organization that you're trying to run. Be that an operating room, be that a children's hospital or a healthcare system. And there are all kinds of experiences and learnings that you can get to try to enhance your competence. And I think you have to be a lifelong learner to look areas where you could do more to get more experience and to get more competence in any of those areas.
Yeah, that's great. You bring in that lifelong learner component, and certainly that's a part of the ethos of this podcast, to try to help folks continue to develop and grow and so forth. And that was something that in my research has come out over and over again, the necessity of being a lifelong learner. As I think about competence and things, one thing that I think is really, for leaders at least, important is to differentiate that to become a leader, the ante is you got to know what you're doing in your particular professional domain, typically. For pediatric surgeons, to be a pediatric surgeon who actually can operate well and take care of patients. For pediatric cardiologists, it's, taking care of kids with congenital heart disease and things. So the ante, just to get into the possibility of being in a leadership position in those roles, is to be good at that professional domain. But then there's also the competence needed for leaders to being able to lead. And so, as I really like to get your thoughts on this, but when I look across different professional fields, whether it's medicine or tech or business or whatever, there are a number of studies that have shown we very often end up with people in leadership positions who have the technical competence component of that, but they lack the leadership competence. And it's that, promoted to the level of incompetence. But anyway, I wanted to get your take, having seen a lot of this. Do you feel like that's accurate?
I think it is. I think one of the fallacies that people have who aspire to leadership is that leadership is intrinsic, or people are just born leaders. That I don't believe that's true at all. I think leadership and leading effectively is a learned behavior. And I think that you have to, if you aspire to be a leader, you have to actively seek out leadership training and leadership learning. So, for example, in my career, I went through 10 years of surgical training to become a pediatric surgery and get 3 boards and all of that kind of stuff. So I had broad expertise in the field of surgical care, and in particular in the field of children's surgical care. And I was running teams every day in the OR, to try and get those to function effectively. But, I didn't feel that made me a great leader. And so, what I did was actively went out and sought additional leadership training. Now, some people do that by getting Masters of Health Policy or Masters of Business Administration. Or I took a little different approach. My wife didn't want me to go off and do another degree while we were trying to raise 3 little kids. And so I would, go for a week or 2 and take a brief course on leadership expertise. I took one at the Kennedy School at Harvard. I took one at the University of Wisconsin. I took one at Brandeis. And those little 2-week, immersions into leadership training, I found extremely valuable because they gave me new ways of thinking. They gave me, a bibliography that I could call on if I wanted to do more reading and get more expertise, but didn't commit me necessarily to taking 2 years of, every weekend I had off going to school and avoiding, being with my family while it was growing up. But I think the important thing is to be intentional about it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, to your point, leadership is something that I believe we all can develop and grow in, and thus the purpose of this podcast, really. And that there are different ways to build that expertise. There's personal study, which I've read hundreds and hundreds of books on the topic. There's formal study, which you hit on with regard to different training programs, and that could be a formal degree program, and that's something I've done, as well as those shorter programs, certifications, and things of that nature that I think are really important. There's coaching and mentoring that are really important. And then the fourth component, typically, of any major leadership development program, really, is being in the midst of it and doing it. Practical experience in leading is the fourth component that people will talk about in leadership development. So I think that, I agree with you. Those things are highly valuable for building our competence. I know that reading is something you value highly. You got a couple of books that you like to recommend to our listeners?
Well, yeah, I think that if you want to go back to the guru of leadership study in the U.S., it's the book Leadership by James McGregor Burns. Burns was a historian. He won the Pulitzer Prize for writing a biography of Franklin Roosevelt. But his book Leadership, which came out in 1978, still holds true today, and just like it did when he brought it out. When people ask me, I want to be a leader, what do you recommend that I read? The first book I give them is Goldman's book on emotional intelligence. I think that to be an effective leader, you need to understand the impact that you have on other people. This is particularly kind of pertinent for me because people can't tell on screen, but I'm 6'3", and so I'm a 6'3" white guy, and so I can be physically imposing. I understand that, and so I've always tried to be cognizant of the effect that I have on people, because how you communicate with people, I think, improves if you understand how they react, or try to understand how they're reacting to you. So I think that book about emotional intelligence is kind of square one for somebody who wants to learn leadership.
Yeah, both those are really good. I think Daniel Goleman, Emotional Intelligence, published in 1995. Great book. I recommend that to a lot of people as well. And then, as you mentioned, Leadership by James McGregor Burns, published in 1978. He also published another book with a very similar title, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was a comparison of multiple leaders. But in the 1978 book, Leadership, just for listeners, that's where he described what is known as transformational leadership, and really launched that thought that the goal of leadership is to help other people to grow and improve as people and accomplish great things. And so, anyway, that's transformational leadership. Recommend.
Yeah, he also defines transactional leadership in that book, which is interacting with people that you lead and how to do that effectively. So
yeah, one thing I think that's worth noting for our listeners is that all of these things don't have to be life and death situations. Obviously, we deal with high stakes that are life and death with regard to the caring for patients, especially children. But there are a lot of other folks that are out there where high stakes could mean having a conversation with someone on the team who's critical for success. And if you really do poorly, they could leave. That could be high stakes. It could be a coach cutting through the noise of the crowd to be able to speak to her player who's about to kick a championship-winning penalty kick, or myriad other things. And so the point here for listeners isn't that high stakes is this life and death sort of thing, but it can take a lot of different forms, and we all want to be able to lead well whenever they arise. And fundamental to that are these things of emotional intelligence and understanding the fundamentals of leadership.
yeah, I agree completely, and I think again, to be effective as a leader, people need to know that you value them. So, for example, the teammate that's about to kick the winning goal, or the winning penalty kick, or whatever, it's not just in that second in time that they need to understand that you value them. It's the whole build up to that they
Right.
understand that they're an important part of the team, and that as the leader, you value their input. I've tried very, very hard. When I was the chief medical officer at Packard, I had a team of associate chief medical officers. All people you knew, Tom, when you were there. But I was very intentional about helping them and guiding them, but making sure that they were able to do their jobs and let them do their jobs, because that builds confidence in a rising leader. And that's, if we're going to mentor leaders coming up through the system, they need to be confident when they have to assume the role. And I'll give you one example of that. When I was the CMO in 2018, I got a phone call from the CEO on Monday, and he said, "Come talk to me." And I went and talked to him, and he told me that he had just received a fatal diagnosis, and he was going to stop working that day, and he wanted me to be the CEO. So by noon, the board had instructed me to be the CEO. Well, I had no formal training as a physician to be a hospital CEO, but I had a pretty good idea what it took, and I had a pretty good idea where we stood as an organization and what we needed to be doing at that point in time to be able to step in and do it. And so, and then the very first thing that I did was to be sure my team was okay, and that everybody would stay in place. We'd all continue to work as a team, including the people that worked for the CEO, not just the people who worked for me. And we would get through it. That was a particularly hard financial time, you may remember, for Packard. But we turned it around. We did a substantial financial turnaround in 8 months and got the place going again. We had just opened a new hospital, and so we had spent all our money, and it wasn't anything that I'd ever planned to do or thought about doing. It just, because of my experiences, it all kind of came natural, and I was able to kind of follow the principles of leadership that I learned over the years.
Denny, I'm curious, in that moment when Chris called you and you went over, and he said that not from the thought about him and his situation, but what did you feel in a sense? Like, here's this thrust upon you in a sense,
Yeah. It's a little bit like going into the operating room and everything coming apart. And you just realize, hey, I got a job to do here. First thing I'm going to do is do my job, and then I'll worry about the emotional side and all that later. And so that's a little bit of what it felt like to me, is that, okay, what do I got to do to keep the ship afloat here? Who can I rely on? I immediately went to a couple of the board members and said, I need you as my personal advisors in this, to help me work through this, so I don't step into something I don't want to step in. And I think with a surgical training, and I'm sure as a cardiologist, when stuff goes sour in the cath lab, you're not worried. You got to take care of the problems. And so that's what I pretty much felt. I shifted gears into getting the job done.
Yeah. I'm hearing basically compartmentalize in a sense. Okay, there's this whole set of things that I need to process sort of personally.
Yeah.
But we've got a mission here. We've got a job to do. Assess the situation very rapidly, seek wise counsel, and then take action on the things that need to be done.
Right.
So I think that's a pattern that anybody can learn from, and would be helpful in those moments when, surprise, literally, you get up one morning and it's just another day, and by the end of the day, you're in this role that you never sought or so forth. So,
right.
Thanks for sharing that.
Well, and I think it's important to recognize that nobody knows everything.
Yeah.
Okay. And so sometimes overconfidence can be, you need confidence to get the job done, but overconfidence is very dangerous. And so, the second thing you mentioned there, which is seek wise counsel, realize that you don't know everything, and look for people you respect to give you help.
Yeah. And it turns out that physicians and folks who tend to have higher levels of cognitive capability and training are more prone to think that they do know everything, which puts us in very vulnerable situations, and perhaps contributes to why we see a dearth of leadership, effective leadership in medicine.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree. There's a book I'm actually rereading that I read before called Think Again. You've probably read this as
Hmm.
well. But, you can be a
Adam
preacher.
Grant, I believe.
Yeah, you can be a preacher, you can be a politician, you can be a prosecutor, you can be a scientist. I urge everybody to try and be a scientist and keep exploring different hypotheses on how to solve problems rather than just digging in.
I think that's good advice. That is a good book. You're right. I've read it. So from your perspective, as we're talking about, knowing what we're doing and being good at it, it's it's almost elementary to say that, but why is it so vital that leaders do that?
A lot of this you can't learn in books. A lot of it you got to learn by doing. And
Mhm.
I've made plenty of mistakes in my leadership journey, but hopefully I've learned by most of them. And I think the more that I have done, the more I can bring to the table. So, for example, I thought I was going to go down a career as an academic surgeon and be a department chair or something like that. I ran a large division of general surgery at University of Wisconsin for 12 years and kind of got my feet wet doing that and decided, well, my favorite thing in life wasn't actually to be a department chair. So that's when I kind of shifted over more to hospital administration. And the reason why I shifted over more to hospital administration was I liked to be able to try and help people build programs. I was a program builder. And so if I got into the right spot in hospital administration, I could hopefully bring resources to bear to smart people to help them build programs. But in order to get in that position, I had to actually do a lot of things. And one of the reasons why I think I was an attractive candidate to Stanford at the time that I was hired, I came from Phoenix Children's Hospital, you may recall,
Mhm.
which is much more of a kind of private type of hospital than an academic hospital. I trained at Harvard, was at Wisconsin, so kind of traditional academic career. But I got into this more community situation where we were, yes, trying to build academics there, but we also were faced with a time when the Affordable Care Act came down and we needed to utilize the tools in the Affordable Care Act to create an integrated clinical network. Well, that's something I had never done before. But over the time there, we built an integrated clinical network with 800 community pediatricians. So I had a lot of heavy interaction with community doctors who weren't in academics and learning what motivated them. So when Packard came looking for somebody to be the chief medical officer, they wanted somebody who had that academic background, but they also wanted to have somebody who could help build the network. As you may recall, we were building a hub and spokes model with Packard Children's Health Alliance using community doctors. And so I kind of was able to bring these experiences that I had together to fill the various niches that Packard was looking for. And I think if I hadn't had those experiences, I probably would have been less effective as the chief medical officer at Packard.
Sure, I think that makes plenty of sense. I tell folks fairly frequently, whether they're mentees or folks I'm coaching or what have you, but you want to know what you're doing. You don't want to know everything that needs to go into a role, right? Like you don't want to any role that you move into there needs to be room for growth, but you got to know certain components of it
Yeah,
going in. So having
ab-
that competence, I think, is instrumental.
yeah, absolutely. And again, I mean, because of the nature of the roles I've been in, I spent a lot of time in physician compensation. As you might imagine, physician compensation is an area that's fairly fraught. But I think being a physician, and I don't have an MBA. My wife said you can't get an MBA. She's got an MBA. I don't need an MBA. But I knew enough about finance and physician compensation that I could talk to doctors and understand from their perspective what was important for them as to how they're valued. And I think that's what physician compensation is about: is how do you show value, that you value people. So I just learned that over the years, and part of those little courses that I was talking about that I would do over the years always included a little bit of finance in them,
Mhm.
so I could understand, profit and loss statements and asset sheets and things like that. So
Yeah. Yeah, I mean those sorts of competencies are also important depending on the domain where somebody is functioning. Certainly need to know those and be good at them. So thinking about this idea of what leaders need to know and so forth, I think as I mentioned earlier, it's probably intuitive for a lot of people, and certainly their entire models. If you look at leadership, their entire competency models that have been devised, and I could go through a bunch of those, but there are two or three that I think would be worth touching on as far as the value of competence with regard to leadership efficacy. So in their 2019 study, Wizittigers and Singthai found that specific leadership competencies are strongly associated with leaders' performance in high-stakes environments and crises. Specifically, they identified preparedness, problem solving, communication, emotional intelligence, which we touched on, and leadership skills were all associated with greater performance in those crises. Additionally, Kosminski and his colleagues have studied team leaders and found that those who had specific leadership competencies, such as anticipating what's about to happen, having a clear vision, and mobilizing team members, were more effective leaders. Additionally, Mary Shane Connolly and her colleagues found that leaders' performance is directly associated with multiple competencies like problem solving, social judgment, and knowledge. So, as we would intuit, the science really shows the importance of knowing what to do and doing it well.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on?
Well, I agree completely, and I think that this has been well studied. But again, I think that the only thing that I would add to that is don't assume you know everything.
Yeah.
On top of that, be willing to take advice and listen to other alternatives, because what gets us in trouble is when we get stuck into one kind of thinking.
Yeah, well, that really hits on something I was going to ask you, is this idea of overconfidence. If situations where, maybe you can share an example, de-identified or what have you, where somebody really thought they were competent, but reality proved otherwise.
I mean, I can think of clinical situations like that. I had a little girl who I had operated on in Boston, who was born without an esophagus, and they'd spent some time in New York trying to do different things, all of which failed, and she ended up coming to Boston. And what I did was one of the not hugely satisfying solutions to that problem, but works, is to take a piece of their colon and put it up in their chest and make an esophagus out of their colon. So this is what I did for this little girl, and she did extremely well for a long time. But one of the problems with that is sometimes the colon grows faster than the child does, and it kinks. And that's what happened to her after about 6 or 7 years, that her colon esophagus had kinked. And instead of coming back to see me in Boston, because it was inconvenient, they lived in New York, she went and saw a highly renowned professor of pediatric surgery in New York, who will remain nameless. But his particular area of expertise was not the esophagus. And so he made a decision to go in and resect the redundant piece of colon and pull the stomach up into the chest, and leaving part of the colon there. But what happened to the poor kid was she got terrible reflux, terrible reflux. And she had bad lungs to start, just made her lungs much worse. And then by that point, I had moved to Wisconsin. They came and saw me in Wisconsin. And, because that was an area where I had a fair amount of expertise, I thought I knew what I was doing. I figured out what was wrong. And so what I did is I took the stomach back down into the abdomen and put a little interposition of small intestine in there. A pretty creative solution, actually. And so now she's got esophagus, colon, small bowel, stomach. But it worked. And she's now married and just had her first baby. Much to my delight. But it was, one of those things where, somebody who was, everybody had telling this person that he was the Geheimrat, he knew everything there was to know, was doing something he really didn't know what to do about. Unfortunately, we were able to bail her out.
Yeah. That's a great example. Thanks for sharing that. That really ties into this psychological concept of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I've discussed that before on the podcast, but just for a refresher for listeners, the study by Kruger and Dunning showed that individuals with low competence often overestimate their abilities, while those with high competence tend to underestimate their abilities. And in fact, in 2022, my colleagues and I published a paper where we looked at this phenomenon in physicians with regard to their assessment of their leadership ability. And we found the same thing, that those who are low competence actually overestimate significantly their competence, and those who are high competent underestimate theirs. So in leadership, the point there is we really must remain self-aware and open to feedback to ensure our perceived competence actually aligns with reality.
Yeah, I could not agree more.
Well, Denny, if you're going to make this practical for our listeners, what would you say are some actionable steps that leaders can take to improve their competence in these different environments, high stakes or otherwise?
Well, we've hit on a couple of them already. I think one is read about leadership. Again, I cannot overemphasize enough how important it is to learn about leadership, because I don't think that leadership is intrinsic. Maybe wanting to be a leader is intrinsic, but certainly being an effective leader is not intrinsic, and you have to learn about it. And you do that by reading, watching, and learning. And I think watch effective leaders, see how they're see what makes them so good. I always used to love, when I was a surgical resident, I used to love to go to the OR and watch the people that I thought were technically superb surgeons, and just watch them operate.
Mm-hmm.
How do they hold their instruments? How do they set up the field? All that kind of stuff. Because if you actually pay attention, there are things there that you can learn.
Yeah.
And most surgical residents just want to do it. I just want to go do it. Well, if I'm stumbling and bumbling through an operation, I'm not helping anybody. But if I go and watch somebody who's a master surgeon do it, I can learn a lot from him or her. So, and I think that that's true in leadership as well. We've all got people that we admire as leaders. What makes them effective? What are they doing that seems to work so well? So I think, watching effective leaders, reading about it, and then again, periodically taking a little piece of time that you can devote specifically to honing your leadership skills is important. Again, you don't necessarily learn it by osmosis. So,
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing those. I think those are right on target as we're discussing those, especially with regard to observing other surgeons. The mantra, "slow is smooth and smooth is fast," kept coming to my mind.
Yeah.
Right. That sometimes the best way to learn to be really good is to slow down and figure out how to do it smoothly.
Yeah. Yeah. And we haven't said much about coaching either, Tom. I do think there's a role for coaching here.
Yeah.
And sharing your nettlesome problems with coaches and giving different approaches to how you might handle things. And when I, as a leader, when I have to help people out of difficult situations, I was pretty liberal about the use of coaches. I think coaches can be very beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Those mentors and coaches, and so that kind of feeds into the five practices that research and experience show can help leaders build competence. One, we've discussed: commit to lifelong learning. It's important to stay up to date in the field and to continue to grow. I like to say, if you're not growing, you're dying. Number two, seek feedback and mentorship, coaching as well. The 4-star generals and admirals that I've gotten to know, they like to say, learn from those who've been there. So I think that's really valuable. Practice under pressure. So make the most of situations, training sessions, real world challenges, and so forth, to say, okay, how can I do this better? What do I need to be thinking about? And be methodical about those moments, because there's so much learning I think that we can do there. Number 4, develop decision-making frameworks. So have a structured approach to complex problems. I think if there's something that, if there's something I could point to that I feel like I excel at, it's being able to develop these sorts of cognitive frameworks that help me with decision-making, complex problems, and so forth. Then number 5, and you hit on this, we talked about this, is stay humble and self-aware, avoid overconfidence, and continually reassess your skills.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question about your frameworks, because I know what I like to do to set up frameworks, but what's your technique for, if you've got a particularly a problem you're trying to solve? How do you like to do that?
Yeah, I think first it's, what is the end goal that I'm trying to get to? So I break things down. There's how urgent and important is this? If it's highly urgent and highly important, then I would practice more of what General Colin Powell said. Get 80% of the data that you need and make the decision, because you're never going to have 100% accuracy. General Patton said, a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. And so, depending on the context, then a different sort of frame comes into mind. But for me, it is, what is the mission? What are the resources available to go toward, to effectively accomplish the mission? What are the perspectives of other people? And then going about and doing it. That's kind of how I look at it. Another framework that I use is the idea of a pre-mortem. I don't know if you've heard of this one, but
yeah.
Basically, for those listening, we've covered this at some point in the past, but imagine yourself down the road after this decision has been made, and you look back and imagine that it really went south, that you made the wrong decision, it turned out poorly. What are the reasons that it turned out poorly that you can imagine? And then you mitigate against those on the front end, so it increases the likelihood of a good outcome. So, but there are a lot of these different sort of decision-making frameworks that actually I've got a bunch that I've crafted and put in my book that's coming out soon. Just have a tendency to
Yeah.
boil stuff down into simple steps.
So I'll show you what a dinosaur I am. I mean, I for this kind of stuff, I tend to rely on the old yellow legal pad. I'll take a
There
yellow
you go.
pad, 2 columns,
Yeah. Ben Franklin, pros and cons.
Pros and cons, you bet. It's exactly and I try to look at all the aspects of what it is I'm trying to accomplish. I think that's, you hit the nail on the head when you pointed that out at the beginning, is what am I trying to accomplish and why? But once I've done that, then I try to look for every aspect of the decision and how it might impact, how does it impact my wife? How does it impact my family? How's it, all of these kinds of things. And you write pros and cons for each one, and then you got to kind of figure out how do you weight all those things.
Right.
And hopefully at the bottom of the yellow pad, you've come up with some guidance on which way you think would be the right way to go.
Yeah. To the point of figuring out what the mission is. What's the problem? Einstein said, if I had an hour to, save the world, I would spend 55 minutes trying to figure out what the problem was.
Yes.
Right. So doing that. Yeah. And as you say, just the process will help, of writing those pros and cons helps you to clarify usually what is important and what's not, and where can you give and where can you not. And a lot of times, especially if you bring in a perspective of someone else, it can give you some wiggle room so that you feel, so that your perspective and your framing of it changes, and you can see answers that you didn't see otherwise.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other important thing about intentionality is that if you aren't intentional about it and try to be inclusive about what are the various aspects of the decision you're trying to make, it's easy to either overweight or underweight some aspect of the decision. But if you spell it all out in front of you there, then hopefully you've kind of considered all the different aspects.
Yeah. Well, Denny, before we wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask you if you could go back to the beginning of your leadership journey and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh boy. I think that I would have been a little more intentional back then about what it is I wanted to be when I grew up. And I'm not claiming that I've actually grown up. So, but I've been extremely fortunate that I've had amazing mentors in my life.
Yeah.
But I stumbled into it. I had an amazing research mentor in Judah Folkman. I had an amazing surgical mentor in Hardy Hendren. I had an amazing administrative mentor in Bing Rickers. But I was just very fortunate to cross paths with those people. And I guess, what I did right in those situations is I actually took advantage of those mentorship opportunities. And so, if I were going to advise young people who want to embark on a leadership journey, is get good mentors. Get good mentors.
Excellent recommendation. I can't agree with you more. Mentors have been extraordinarily valuable for me, certainly. Thanks for sharing that, Denny. I think it's an excellent way to close out our conversation. It's really been great to have you on the show and get to talk with you. Thank you for joining me on the Science of Leadership today.
Well, Tom, I'm honored that you asked me to get on here. I wish you all the best of luck with the book, and I'll look forward to reading it when it comes out.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.